Once upon a time, in the sprawling maze of corrugated iron sheets and mud walls that is Kibera, there lived a boy whose dreams were as big as his stomach was empty. His name was Mwangi, and if you listen carefully in the early morning hours, you could hear the rhythmic tap-tap-tap of his father's hammer against worn leather, the sound that would shape his childhood and, unknowingly, his character. Mwangi's world was 10 feet by 12 feet of shared space with his father, Samuel, his mother, Grace, and his little sister, Wanjiku. Their home had walls so thin you could hear Mrs. Kamau's baby crying 3 shacks away, and a roof that played drums whenever the rains came. But Samuel's corner. That corner was magic. There, surrounded by the smell of leather polish and old shoes, Samuel worked miracles. "Baba, why do you fix the same shoes over and over?" 6-year-old Mwangi asked one sweltering afternoon, watching his father carefully stitch a sole that had been reattached more times than anyone could count. Samuel looked up, his weathered hands never pausing in their work. "My son," he said, his voice carrying the weight of wisdom earned through hardship, "these shoes carry people to their dreams. A teacher walks to school in these. A mother runs to the hospital for her sick child. A man goes to look for work to feed his family. When I fix these shoes, I'm not just mending leather, I'm mending hope." From that day forward, Mwangi saw his father differently. Samuel wasn't just a cobbler struggling to make 20 shillings a day. He was a keeper of dreams, a guardian of hope, a man who understood that sometimes the journey to your destiny begins with making sure you have something decent on your feet. The sound of the school bell at Kibera Primary was both a blessing and a curse for Mwangi. A blessing because it meant another day of learning, another day closer to the dreams that danced in his head at night. A curse because it reminded him every morning that he was different. He was one of the children who walked to school barefoot. Not because his father couldn't afford shoes. Lord knows Samuel could have fixed him a pair from the dozens that came through their little corner. But those shoes belonged to paying customers, people whose 20 or 30 shillings meant the difference between Wanjika eating dinner or going to bed hungry. So Mwangi walked the dusty paths of Kibera with feet that grew tough as leather, carrying books wrapped in plastic to protect them from the rain that turned the slum's roads into rivers of mud. Mwangi has no shoes. Mwangi has no shoes. The chant followed him some mornings, led by children whose families had just a little more than his own. But instead of running or fighting back, Mwangi would stop, turn around, and smile. "You're right," he would say, wiggling his bare toes in the dust. "But look how fast I can run without them." And he would take off, leaving a cloud of dust and laughter behind him, his bare feet slapping against the earth like drums announcing his arrival at the future. His teacher, Mrs. Njeri, noticed everything. She saw how Mwangi's eyes lit up during mathematics lessons, how he devoured every book in their small library, how he stayed after school to help younger children with their homework even when his own stomach was growling. She saw a boy whose mind was rich even when his pockets were empty. "Mwangi," she said one evening as he prepared to walk home, "you have something special in here." She tapped her temple, and here, she touched her heart. "Don't let anyone convince you that where you come from determines where you're going." Those words planted themselves in Mwangi's chest like seeds in fertile soil, growing stronger every day. The rains that year came like they were angry at the world. They turned Kibera into a brown, muddy maze where children got sick and dreams seemed to wash away with the dirty water that flowed between the shacks. The path to school became treacherous, and many children simply stopped coming. But not Mwangi. Every morning, he would wrap his books in not 1 but 3 plastic bags, kiss his mother goodbye, and wade through water that sometimes reached his knees. His feet, already tough from months of walking barefoot, became his greatest allies as he navigated the slippery paths that would have been impossible in shoes anyway. But the rains brought more than just mud. They brought hunger that gnawed at bellies like a wild animal, and sickness that took the weak and the old. Samuel's cobbler business slowed to almost nothing. Who needs shoes repaired when you're walking through floods? The 20 shillings a day dwindled to 5, then 3, then some days, nothing at all. Grace started waking up at 4 a.m. to walk to the market, selling small bags of sukuma wiki and tomatoes, her smile never wavering even when customers complained about prices she had no control over. Wanjiku grew thinner, her big eyes growing bigger in her small face. And Mwangi watched it all, his young heart breaking and hardening at the same time. One particularly bad night, as they huddled together listening to the rain hammer their tin roof like bullets, Grace whispered to Samuel, "Maybe Mwangi should stop school for a while. Help you with the shop or find small jobs."
No.
Samuel's voice cut through the darkness like lightning. Education is the only thing they can't take away from him. Let him be hungry now so he can feast later. Mwangi pretended to be asleep, but those words burned themselves into his memory. His father was choosing his future over their present comfort. That night, as the rain continued its assault on their little home, Mwangi made a promise to himself and to the darkness. He would make this sacrifice worth it. Mrs. Njeri had been teaching for 23 years, and she had learned to recognize the signs. The way a brilliant child's eyes would slowly dim as hunger became their constant companion. The way attendance would drop as families chose survival over education. She had seen too many bright minds disappear into the struggles of Kibera, swallowed by the immediate needs of today, never getting the chance to shine tomorrow. But Mwangi was different. Even on the days when his stomach growled so loudly during lessons that other children giggled, his hand was always the first one up. Even when his clothes grew looser and his face thinner during the worst of the rains, his homework was still perfect, still handed and wrapped carefully in plastic. After the Case P mock exams, Mrs. Njeri sat in her small office, staring at the results with tears in her eyes. Mwangi had scored 487 out of 500, the highest score she had seen in her entire career. But she knew that without intervention, this brilliant boy would disappear after primary school, another casualty of poverty's cruel mathematics. That evening, she did something she had never done before. She walked to Kibera, following Mwangi's directions through the narrow paths until she found the little shack with Samuel's cobbler sign hanging outside. The smell of leather polish and cooking ugali mingled in the evening air. "Are you Mwangi's parents?" she asked Grace, who was stirring a pot with barely enough food for one person, somehow trying to make it stretch for four. When Samuel emerged from his corner, leather apron still tied around his waist, Mrs. Njeri took a deep breath and said the words that would change everything. "Your son is the most brilliant student I have ever taught. But brilliance without opportunity is like a seed without water. I want to help him grow." Mrs. Njeri didn't just bring news that evening. She brought hope wrapped in the form of a business card. "There's someone you need to meet," she told Samuel and Grace. "His name is Dr. Kamani, and he runs a foundation that helps exceptional students from backgrounds like yours." Dr. James Kamani had grown up in Mathar, another slum not far from Kibera. He remembered the hunger, the walking to school in torn shoes, the way dreams seemed impossible when you're just trying to survive each day. But he had been lucky. A Catholic priest had seen his potential and helped him get a scholarship. Now, as one of Nairobi's most successful lawyers, he had made it his mission to be that helping hand for other children climbing out of poverty. The day Mwangi met Dr. Kamani was a Saturday. Samuel had closed his cobbler shop early, and the whole family had scrubbed themselves clean with the precious soap Grace saved for special occasions. They walked to the foundation's offices in the city center, Mwangi's bare feet stepping onto carpeted floors for the first time in his life. Dr. Kamani was not what Mwangi expected. He was tall, yes, and wore a suit that probably cost more than Samuel made in 3 months. But his eyes were kind, and when he shook Mwangi's hand, his grip was firm and warm. "Tell me about yourself, young man," Dr. Kamani said, settling back in his leather chair. For the next hour, Mwangi talked about his dreams, his love for mathematics and literature, his plans to become a lawyer, so he could help families like his own. Dr. Kamani listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding, his eyes never leaving Mwangi's face. "You know," Dr. Kamani said finally, "when I was your age, I used to walk to school barefoot too. My father sold vegetables by the roadside, and my mother washed clothes for other families. People told me boys like us don't become lawyers. They said we should be grateful for whatever small jobs we could get." Mwangi leaned forward, hanging on every word. But here's what I learned, Mwangi. Poverty is not a permanent address. It's just where you start, not where you have to end up. The question is, are you ready to work harder than everyone else to prove them wrong? When they left that office, Mwangi carried with him not just the promise of a scholarship to Alliance High School, but something more valuable, the knowledge that his dreams were not too big for a boy from Kibera. Alliance High School felt like stepping into another world. The buildings were made of stone, not corrugated iron. The dormitories had beds with actual mattresses, not thin foam on concrete floors. And for the first time in his life, Mwangi had shoes, proper black leather shoes that came with his scholarship package. But if he thought the hardest part was behind him, he was wrong. The academic work was more challenging than anything he had faced at Kibera Primary. His classmates came from families who had been preparing them for this level of education their entire lives. They spoke English fluently, while Mwangi still thought in Kikuyu and translated. They had laptops and smartphones while he had never touched a computer. The first month was brutal. Mwangi would stay up until midnight in the library, struggling with physics concepts that seemed to come naturally to his roommate, whose father was an engineer. During chemistry practicals, he watched in amazement as other students handled expensive equipment like they were extensions of their own hands, while he was terrified he might break something worth more than his family's entire yearly income. "Maybe I don't belong here," he whispered to himself one night after receiving his first test results. A C+ in mathematics, the subject he had always dominated. But then he remembered his father's words. "When I fix these shoes, I'm not just mending leather, I'm mending hope." Mwangi realized that his scholarship wasn't just about his education. It was about mending the hope of everyone in Kibera who had ever been told their dreams were too big. He started waking up at 4 a.m., the same time his mother used to leave for the market. While his classmates slept, he studied. He asked questions until his teachers grew tired of answering. He formed study groups with other scholarship students who understood the weight of the opportunity they carried. Slowly, the C+ became AB-, then AB, then AB+. By the end of his first year, Mwangi was ranked 7th in his class. By his final year, he was 2nd overall and the school's debate captain, arguing passionately about social justice and educational reform with the eloquence of someone who had lived the problems he was debating. University was supposed to be the promised land, but for Mwangi, it felt more like standing at the base of Mount Kenya, looking up at a peak that seemed to stretch into the clouds. The University of Nairobi's law school was filled with the children of judges, politicians, and businessmen, young people who discussed internships at their parents' law firms over coffee that cost more than Samuel used to make in a day. Mwangi's scholarship covered tuition and accommodation, but barely left anything for food, books, or the small luxuries that other students took for granted. While his classmates went out for dinners and weekend trips, Mwangi worked evenings at a small legal aid clinic in downtown Nairobi, helping poor families navigate a justice system that seemed designed to keep them out. It was there, in a cramped office that smelled of old files and desperation, that Mwangi found his true calling. He met women who had been cheated out of their land, men who had been fired without compensation, children who needed someone to speak for them in family court. These people reminded him of his own family, of his neighbors in Kibera, of everyone who had ever needed hope but couldn't afford to buy it. Dr. Kamani would visit the clinic sometimes, and he watched with pride as his protege handled cases with a combination of brilliant legal mind and genuine compassion that couldn't be taught in any classroom. "You're not just learning law, Mwangi," Dr. Kamani told him one evening as they walked through the city center. "You're learning justice. And there's a difference. Law is what's written in books. Justice is what lives in your heart." During his final year, Mwangi's thesis on access to justice for Kenya's urban poor won the university's Best Student Research Award. But more importantly, it caught the attention of some of the country's most prominent human rights lawyers. Job offers started coming in from prestigious firms in Nairobi and even international organizations. As graduation approached, Mwangi stood once again at a crossroads. He could take the high-paying job, move to a nice neighborhood, and finally lift his family out of poverty. Or he could follow the calling that had been growing in his heart since those days in the legal aid clinic. The night before graduation, he called his father. "Baba," he said, "I want to start my own firm. I want to help people like us. But it means we might struggle a little longer." Samuel's laugh came through the phone line like music. "My son," he said, "I didn't fix all those shoes just so you could wear expensive ones. I fixed them so you could walk your own path. Walk it proudly." 5 years after graduation, Mwangi stood in the doorway of his law firm, Mwangi and Associates, advocates for social justice. It wasn't the biggest firm in Nairobi, but it was the one that never turned away a client because they couldn't pay. The walls were lined with thank you letters from families they had helped, photos of children who had gotten justice in custody cases, and certificates from various human rights organizations. His phone buzzed with a message from Mrs. Njeri. "Mwangi, I have a student who reminds me of you. Brilliant, hardworking, barefoot. Can we talk?" Mwangi smiled and immediately called her back. "Tell me about this child," he said, settling into his chair, the same one Dr. Kamani had been sitting in years ago when he had offered hope to a boy from Kibera. That afternoon, Mwangi drove back to Kibera for the launch of the Mwangi Foundation. The same narrow paths he had walked barefoot as a child were now filled with people, teachers, parents, children, and community leaders, all gathered to celebrate the opening of the Foundation's first scholarship program. Samuel sat in the front row, wearing the same leather apron he had worn for 30 years, but now he was beaming with pride. Grace dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, and Wanjiku, now a university student herself, benefiting from her brother's success, held up a banner that read, "From Kibera to everywhere, dreams have no address." As Mwangi spoke to the crowd about the 10 scholarships they would award that year, his eyes found a small boy sitting at the back, barefoot, clutching a worn notebook to his chest, eyes bright with the same hunger for knowledge that had driven Mwangi himself all those years ago. "Dreams," Mwangi told the crowd, his voice carrying over the tin roofs and mud walls of the place that had made him, "are not luxury items that only the wealthy can afford. Dreams are the birthright of every child, regardless of whether they have shoes on their feet or food in their bellies." Today, we're not just giving scholarships. We're giving wings to dreams that are ready to fly. Later that evening, as the sun set over the sprawling expanse of Kibera, Mwangi sat with his father in the little cobbler corner where it all began. The tap-tap-tap of Samuel's hammer against leather still filled the air, but now it sounded different to Mwangi's ears. It sounded like applause. "You know what, Baba?" Mwangi said, watching his father work with the same careful precision he had admired as a child. "You were right. You weren't just mending shoes. You were mending hope. And now I'm doing the same thing, just with different tools." Samuel looked up from his work, his weathered hands holding a small shoe that belonged to some child who would walk to school tomorrow, carrying dreams in their heart just like Mwangi once had. "My son," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "the circle is complete. But the story? The story is just beginning." And in the distance, if you listened carefully over the sounds of Kibera settling into evening, you could hear it, the sound of hope being mended, one dream at a time. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more motivational stories.